What's up, guys? It is Thursday night, 11 p.m. We are not here with Anthony Grimani this time. We are here with Matthew Pose. How's it going, Matthew?
I'm doing well.
So I want to cover a different topic than what we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 live streams. I want to talk about listening tests, how to compare loudspeakers, stereo versus mono listening tests. I know in the industry, when you're talking about objectively comparing speakers, like the research that Harman's done, they primarily do mono listening tests. Now, you and I and the rest of the audience, we don't listen to speakers in mono, especially since maybe the 1950s. We have stereo recordings, and of course, stereo is a superior form of listening to music. But there are merits to doing mono listening tests, but we also believe that there are some limitations to doing the mono listening tests. That's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. Matthew created a PowerPoint. And guys, if you want access to this PowerPoint after the presentation, go to our Patreon at patreon.com/audioholics. It will be there, and you can follow along with the slide presentation at your own leisure if you want to rewatch this video. So Matt, why do we have this debate about stereo versus mono listening?
Well, basically, there was research that was done, and we're going to get into this, that showed that doing mono listening tests was basically more resolving. It was better capable of helping understand what are actual audible problems in a speaker. And so Harman's gone ahead and done the tests basically using just one speaker in mono over the years because it makes it easier for listeners to be able to hear problems in the speaker. The other side of it, though, as you said, was we don't listen that way. So a lot of people have said, well, how do you do valid listening tests in mono? Don't you need stereo to really be able to hear everything? And the main debate basically it centers around imaging and sound staging. And you and I have agreed that that actually is a valid debate. There really are aspects of imaging or sound staging that a mono test can't get at. And so then the issue becomes, are there differences between speakers in imaging that these types of stereo listening tests would be necessary for? And we think the answer is yes.
Okay. So, I could see the debate for pro mono. It's almost like when you're evaluating room correction systems. If you try to evaluate a room correction system in surround sound, it's very hard to discern whether or not the room correction was beneficial. But if you put it in 2-channel, it's less confusing. You could focus more on the sound and really determine if the room correction was beneficial or not. You kind of agree with that line of reasoning?
Yeah, and actually there's research that's been done that compared people's ability to hear differences in the timbre of their system, which room correction plays a big role in, going from mono to stereo to multi-channel. And basically it becomes harder to tell the differences the more channels you add in. And to be honest, I'm not sure we know why. I don't know that there's definitive research. My kind of own theory is that the brain essentially becomes distracted by the increased number of channels and it becomes more difficult, but there may be more going on than that.
Also, when you have more channels, it kind of fills in the gap. So maybe it just gives you better sound, generally speaking. So the differences between good sound and better sound are harder to discern.
Could be.
All right. So I'm going to share the screen.
All right. Let me know because it should be a blank screen.
It's black right now. Yeah.
All right. Well, it's because there's an animation. I want people to see that.
Oh, nice.
Do mono listening testing tell the whole story? Well, we don't think so. And I know there's going to be some people who are going to say, but Matt, research has been done, and I'm sure you didn't do your own research. So come on, don't you have to follow the research? Well, let's start where it began. So Floyd Toole, who we've referenced a lot, we're friends with, conducted a study in 1983, quite a long time ago, entitled Subjective Measurements of Loudspeakers, Comparisons of Stereo and Mono Listening. And what they found was blinded listeners were more easily able to discern differences in sound quality when listening in mono versus stereo. So you take 3-4 speakers, you put them in front of an individual, you ask them to rate the differences between those speakers on a set of, we'll call them the dimensions of sound. And you do it in mono and you see what their scores are. You do it in stereo, you see what their scores are, and you see how the scores differ between the mono and the stereo across the 3 speakers. And what they found was there was greater variation in mono than in stereo. And these differences actually persisted in a particular dimension, which is the spatial quality. So another interpretation of the finding, though, is that they had stronger preferences for differences they perceived in mono than in stereo. In other words, they weren't as picky when we got to stereo. And that's an important thing. So our own James Larson has pointed out before. So sorry, James, I'm throwing you under the bus here. But our own James Larson has pointed out before that um, given that we listen in stereo and given that the research seems to suggest that we aren't as picky or discerning when we're in stereo, that maybe those differences aren't as important either because they're not going to be as noticeable under normal listening conditions. So why does mono reveal differences more widely? As I said before, I actually am not sure that we know this. If somebody knows of literature that has definitively answered this, I'd love to see it, but I'm not aware of any. That's Sean Olive in the background there. So one thing to keep in mind, in the stereo reproduction introduces a number of distortions, including comb filtering. This addition could negate some of the differences between speakers and mono. So I think, Gene, you were getting at that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible that our brains become more distracted, this is my own idea, by the larger number of things to pay attention to in stereo, making it harder to attend to the small differences in timbre, distortion, and spaciousness.
So a question I have for you on the comb filtering argument. I would think comb filtering would be more of an issue if both speakers were playing in mono, but because they're in stereo, they're not really fully correlated audio signals. So the comb filtering should be a lot less than it would be if it was in mono, right?
If you had two speakers in mono, and the test that they're doing, as you can see here, is a single speaker in mono.
Right.
But yes, okay. So what you're saying is true, but if you think about it, there's a center image typically in music. Quite a bit of content in music is monophonic, and so any of that monophonic content creates the comb filtering.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right. So there's a problem with the spaciousness finding, and it's the fact. So the fact that listeners heard greater differences between sources in terms of their spatial quality in mono is an obvious finding. And I've actually included a graphic here to explain basically why it's so obvious. So spaciousness is a quality in a speaker that, or any source for that matter, that's related to our sense of envelopment. It's sort of how the sound that emanates out of that speaker gives us the sense of being surrounded by the sound, and it's caused by reflections off of primarily the sidewalls. And so a speaker that has wider dispersion will have stronger sidewall reflections. That increases the dissimilarity, which is the interaural cross correlation. That's how you measure it, I should say, with it. It increases the dissimilarity between the left and the right lateral reflections. And that increase causes us to perceive that source as more spacious. Now, one of the subjective ways we hear that is actually it sounds bigger than actually the speaker itself, so less like a point source. You can imagine then that if you have two speakers and they're spread apart, that you now have a significantly larger number of lateral reflections. They are stronger, and there is even greater dissimilarity because it's two different speakers. And so as a result of that, the IACC goes down even further. There's even less correlation, and the spaciousness goes up. So the fact that people were hearing greater differences between mono and stereo is obvious because the differences in the dispersion of the speaker would be more obvious than it would be when you move to stereo. And the reason for that is because essentially there's an upper limit. There's a point at which the spaciousness kind of maxes out. It's not that we don't hear any more differences, but if you can think of it as a curve, instead of it continuing to go up like this, it kind of goes like this, where we start to flatline a little bit and we don't notice those differences as much.
Would there really be a dissimilarity if the speakers are identical and the sidewall reflections are identical? If you have
So you got to remember that the reflections at mid and high frequencies in a room are stochastic. And what that means is that there are still essentially random variations in the reflections off the left and the right wall. They're not fixed at any given point in time. And so as a result of that, the specific reflection you see coming from the left wall versus the right wall at any point in time won't be exactly the same. So they won't be correlated. It doesn't mean there isn't like the steady state response of the reflection coming off the left wall and the right wall will be the same, but the steady state response is actually those reflections accumulated over a period of time. That's not an instantaneous thing. So for any instance, though, there's going to be differences. So going back to this drawing, this is obviously not how the mono tests are done, but what you can see is that there's a much larger red area with the two speakers than there is with the one speaker. And so that shows you just how much more sound energy is going on when you've got two speakers. I mean, it's more than double the red area that you see in the first one. All right, so I already talked about envelopment, it's essentially what we perceive as spaciousness. So two speakers have more lateral reflections, greater lateral dissimilarity. two speakers will sound more spacious and hide the differences to some extent. So in other words, it's obvious that they were hearing those differences to a greater extent, but that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. And it doesn't mean that the more spacious speaker is better. But in mono, probably you would perceive the more spacious speaker is better. In stereo, that's not necessarily true. And there's good reason for that. So let's go back to like the subjectivity of spaciousness. So as I mentioned, those early reflections are key to how we perceive spaciousness, and it's the ones that come off the sidewall. So it's an imprecise term, and it's become synonymous with envelopment. So there actually used to be sort of this scientific approach to trying to measure spaciousness and envelopment as if they were two different things. And for the most part, most people have essentially said, it's the same thing, and they're basically defined and measured the same way. And it's the perception of being surrounded by the reproduced sound and giving a good sense of space around you. From a subjective standpoint, it has further been defined by its preciseness, the extent to which a speaker presents the individual instruments and voices to be clearly placed and separated in the spatial sound image, how precise are the individual sound sources positioned in the room, and if the individual sound sources are inadvertently spread or broadened out, the precision is low. So in other words, if they're too spread out, bigger than real life type thing, that's considered low precision. And that is an accepted definition used in Mushra testing as defined in the Perceptual Characteristics of Loudspeakers 2015. This is not what was used in 1983. This obviously didn't exist at that time, but it's a standard today. I don't want to say for sure that Harman uses it, but somebody from Harman sent it to me, so I'm going to assume that that is in fact the document they use for their testing today. So the point is, there are actually multiple dimensions to sound staging and imaging. And even in the spaciousness piece, there's more than one dimension. So in mono, there's pretty clear differences between wide and narrow dispersion speakers and how we perceive the size of the image, if you will, that it creates. And that's often called spaciousness. But when you have two speakers, there's another dimension that becomes more apparent, and that's precision. Precision doesn't really show up that much in mono, to a point. I don't want to say it's not there at all. But for the most part, with a mono source, you've got something kind of dead center in front of you, assuming that's where the speaker is. And you'll hear some front and back differences. You know, there's some depth to the sound stage, but you're not obviously going to hear any left to right. There can't be any left to right differences because there's nothing to create lateral separation like that. But with two speakers, you have that. And so precision this is where you get big differences between narrow and wide dispersion and a whole lot of debate over which is right, which is wrong. And actually, I think I have slides for that. So here we go. Spaciousness does not equal soundstage and imaging. The standard definition for soundstaging and imaging is a multidimensional and complex set of criteria. So here are the definitions that come out of that book I was telling you about. So spatial, sound, image, distance, width, depth, stereo balance. These are things we've all heard before and we know. And then there's spatial localization. So when we talk about the soundstage, often we're thinking about the musicians and the instruments being placed up on a stage in front of us. So part of it is when you're hearing music in a club, you do hear this sort of envelopment. The sound is coming from all around you. There's natural reverberation going on. That's a three-dimensional thing. There's externalization. It's in front of you. It's not behind you. And then it's not in your head. That's actually the more important one. And then precision. And this is the one that I think is the most important of these. Precision is this idea of like, so if you think about, you've got a small club, right? We'll say, Gene, you and I have decided we're going to go out to a blues club. We're going to listen to some blues. And it's actually a pretty small club. It's actually maybe only about 6,000 or 7,000 cubic feet. And so this is probably just a little bit larger, for instance, than your new home theater, which for a club, that would be pretty small. So in a space like that, it would be considered acoustically intimate. And what that's going to mean is that there's going to be relatively short duration reflections. They're going to happen quickly in time relative to the direct sound. There's going to be a very high direct to reflected ratio of sound. And as a result of that, we're probably going to be able to hear those musicians' location very precisely. So we're going to be able to hear exactly where they're coming from. Another example are studio recordings. They're typically direct mic'd. There's just no room in there. Everything that's put in is artificial. And as a result of that, there's a high degree of precision. You can hear them. It's like laser focused. Now, Gene, you and I decide we're going to go out to a symphony. There's no precision there, right? You can hear them on the stage. You can maybe sort of generally hear that the violin section is here, and the cellos are over here, maybe the flutes are over on the other side. That's about it. And you'd be lucky if you could hear that. I mean, if you've got seats way back, you're not even going to hear that. It's just everything is kind of emanating from in front of you. So in those scenarios, you've got very low direct reflected energy. And as I said, the image precision tends to be very low. So very wide dispersion speakers in a very lively room will have a high degree of envelopment. There's going to be good externalization, but there's not going to be good precision. Narrow dispersion speakers tend to do the opposite. They tend to have less envelopment. They still have good externalization, but they're going to have very high precision. And you're not going to notice that in mono. You're only going to notice that in stereo. So that's really our argument.
Does that also have to do with the narrow dispersion speakers giving you a greater proportion of direct to reflected sound? Is that why?
Well, that's part of what's affecting it. Yeah, I mean, the narrow dispersion speakers have weaker sidewall reflections. It's essentially the same thing as putting absorption. You could take a wide dispersion speaker, put a lot of absorption on the sidewall, and you get much the same effect. But in this case, we're talking about speaker tests.
Right.
All right. So does research show that mono tests can accurately discern all differences of sound stage? So as I said, we say no, in part because nobody's ever studied it. So part of why we're saying that this isn't something that the research can say is that the research on this is pretty limited. There hasn't been a whole lot of tests, and trying to really understand all the differences that exist is a result of sound staging and imaging, or I should say changes in the speaker that affect sound staging and imaging. The studies just haven't been done. Most of them that have been done are relatively weak in this regard. And it's not a criticism of what's been done. It was done basically because it was what was feasible. If you look at, for instance, the research that was done at NRC and later by Harman, and then certainly there's been others who have done it, a lot of it was, what can we do with the speakers available to us and the technology we have? So they're a little bit crude. I don't want that to seem like a criticism again, but they are a little bit crude in trying to answer certain questions. So I've kind of mentioned some of the ones that I've raised. So here are some examples of unanswered questions. What effect does the directivity index have on distance, width, depth, precision, and envelopment? And what effect does the room acoustics have on distance, width, depth, precision, and envelopment? So there's a need for us to really get precise in our understanding from a research standpoint, how varying the directivity index, which is a measure of the narrow versus wide dispersion of the speaker and the consistency of it, as well as the room acoustics, because as I said, they play together. So you can actually get some of the same subjective changes by changing the room acoustics instead of changing the speaker. And you've got to hold all else constant. So if you think about this from a study standpoint, how do you take a speaker and change its dispersion pattern, but you don't change anything else? Nothing else can be different that could affect how we perceive the sound of that speaker. And the answer is you can't do that. I mean, there are some very sophisticated speakers now that use DSP and many drivers that allow them to widen and narrow the dispersion.
You're talking about like the lexicon one, right?
Yeah, which, as you know, I've been bugging them to send me some so we can do the research, but I don't even think they make it anymore, so that didn't happen.
It's a concept speaker.
I tried to convince Sean to do the research. I don't think he was as interested, in part because I don't know that anyone cares that much other than maybe me.
Well, and in their defense, they're all moved on to headphones now. Headphones are the big moneymaker, and all the research that's going on, as far as I know, at Harman is really focused on headphones.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. I don't think he was literally just didn't care. I think it's, as you said, they've moved on to things that they can make money on. Yeah. They're not making money on changing the directivity index. But the point is, when you do experiments, you're always trying to change one parameter and then hold all other parameters constant. Otherwise, any differences you see, you don't know what caused it.
Attributed to.
Yeah. So when Floyd Toole had done this research before, they used a different approach. It's not a bad one. It's just not as precise, and it has limitations. So what that one was they essentially categorized speakers into different types of directivity index levels. And so then that allowed them to say like kind of narrow versus wide dispersion. But they were taking advantage of just natural differences in speakers that were on the market. They didn't control it.
One thing I noticed about their research too, if you look at their, I guess the loudspeaker preferences, where they show you, they ranked different speakers from these listening tests. The ones that scored the worst in their listening test tended to be like a dipole speaker, like a Martin Logan ESL. They scored worse in mono than they did in stereo, but they didn't really talk too much about that. And maybe that has something to do with what we're talking about, that maybe in those cases, those speakers have more advantages for giving you more precision and stereo imaging, just because of the nature of how the speaker works. You can't see that in a mono test, but it shows up when you have two speakers playing stereo.
Well, and certainly a lot of people will talk about the very precise imaging that they get from panel speakers like ESLs. And one of the reasons for that is that when you get that dipole radiation, what it's actually doing is canceling the side reflections. So even though you've got sound coming out the back of the speaker, remember that that precision and that spaciousness is coming primarily from the strength of those lateral reflections. ESL speakers have extremely weak lateral reflections. They're actually much narrower dispersion than horn speakers. So I've heard people say the opposite. I don't know where they got this idea from. They're not measured correctly very often because it's hard to measure one of those speakers. But if you think about the cardioid radiation pattern, which is a figure-8 pattern, as being the sound radiation that comes out of an ESL, that cancellation means that you're getting like a laser beam of sound. It's very, very narrow. I mean, many of those often have like radiation patterns that would, the -6 dB point would be anywhere from 30 to 60 degrees, which is, and it does it over a very wide bandwidth. So that's very narrow.
Even when the panel's curved, even when
so the curve widens it, but it's like you're going from 30 to 60. You're not going to like 180. It's very narrow. I mean, there's, as I said, there's not a lot of good measurements to go by, and I'm not even 100% sure I could accurately measure one of those, but the few I've seen have shown them to be very, very narrow dispersion.
So that's interesting, because people that are running Martin Logan ESLs, I wonder if they're putting a lot of sidewall absorption when they shouldn't be, because it's not needed.
It's really not needed. It's basically just lowering the RT60 of the room. And what I would argue is that you do want to maintain some amount of lateral reflections. Like you don't want to, actually, Sean and I were talking about this earlier, I think it was today or yesterday, and he made a point. So we were getting into the idea. So I'm just going to say, Anthony, in case you hear this, I'm not picking on you, I swear. But he was saying he's always a little skeptical of people who design and treat rooms. And the argument was that people who design and treat rooms are often selling acoustic panels. And if they're selling acoustic panels, it's in their best interest to then say, well, the room needs a lot of treatment because they sell more panels. And his point was, in many cases, you don't necessarily need a lot of treatment. Where you mostly need to focus your treatment on is on the front of the room, which is behind the speakers, and the back of the room. The ceiling can be potentially a good place. The side walls is, Floyd would say, optional. Sean was saying probably not necessary. And if you think about it, what he was saying, though, is you could make a room really dry. And Gene, I've made this point to you before, too. You can make a room really dry, and then you remove a lot of the negative problems of the room, because the notion that the room's going to provide some spatial support, you know, one of the issues you've got is, yes, it will, but the notion that it's going to provide spatial support that's anywhere near on par what you have in a symphony hall is a little bit ludicrous. Like, the small room is never going to sound like a big room, no matter how you treat it. You could fill it with all the diffusers you want. Those reflections are never going to be as long as they are. It's never going to have reverb, basically. So it's never going to actually sound like a symphony. And as a result, you can't really have a spatial support that's equal to that. So
you need more speakers.
Yeah, you need more speakers. So one argument is just get rid of the room, just dry it out. You know, not necessarily anechoic, but make it very, very like the RT60 time, or the RDT is more correct for small rooms, would end up being something like 0.2 seconds or less. And in a room like that, you have to have an up mixer and surround speakers to get spaciousness back, because there's nothing, like, the room's got nothing left to supply. Now, some people like a room like that anyway, but that won't give you a very realistic reproduction of something like a symphony without the up mixer. So what
my view on that is, if you can't sit in a room and comfortably have a conversation without it feeling weird, you probably overtreated the room.
Yeah, and that would be a very treated room. So the other way you can go is you can maintain some level of spaciousness in there. You have a higher RT60 time, and you treat the room a little bit differently. And so he was saying, like, given that most people are going to sometimes listen in stereo, sometimes listen in surround, it makes sense to leave some in there. And so his argument for that, though, of course, was don't treat the sidewalls, leave them alone, even if you've got these narrow dispersion speakers, or even if you are trying to get that sort of narrow dispersion effect with sidewall absorbers. So going back to the Martin Logans, I would make the argument that since they already have very, very weak lateral reflections, I just leave those sidewalls alone. Like, you're going to have nothing left for spaciousness otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we beat that dead horse. So
yeah.
Some obvious points about what is lost with mono. The precise placement of a phantom source is impossible with a mono source. So one of the tests that gets done in research, but it is how, like, music works when you think about it, is that they do these phantom source tests where they point a laser at the wall and then they move the image around, and they have the person point the laser where they see it, and they look at how accurate it is relative to where it should appear to be coming from. And they'll sometimes look to see if they can fool people, like they'll put an LED light up and see if the person thinks the phantom image has moved to a different place than where it's supposed to be because of this visual distraction. And so you can only do that with 2 speakers or more. You can't do that with 1 speaker. And that is actually an aspect of how we perceive a soundstage. So precise placement of phantom images requires stereo. And if we're going to review a speaker, for instance, and we want to know how good a job it does in presenting a soundstage, we want to know its precision. Studies have been conducted to examine the effect of acoustics in multi-channel versus stereo on perceived phantom source placement. These studies have found that multi-channel allows for more accurate phantom image placement than stereo. That should be obvious. And the significant reflections and reverberation in the room tend to reduce accuracy. So there's actually this idea that if you are, in fact, using the speakers to help create that envelopment and image placement, that if the room actually is too lively, it's not helping. And so narrow dispersion speakers tend to be better for those systems. If the acoustics impact image placement, then so would the speaker's directivity. And these 2 factors are interrelated. So I mentioned that earlier, that the acoustics, basically the sidewall reflections, and the directivity go hand in hand. So subjective impressions of imaging in speakers. Most people have perceived differences in what they call imaging for different speakers, but why? So if at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether you do stereo or mono, that you can get everything you need from mono, I think a lot of people are going to say, well, I've heard clear differences, though, between different types of speakers, some image much better than others. What am I hearing? Is it just spaciousness? And as I mentioned, it is actually related to the same set of factors, but how we perceive it is a bit different. So narrow dispersion have weaker lateral reflections, and that tends to create a less spacious image. The instruments sound more like a point source, so you can kind of tell more exactly where they're coming from. And subjectively, this creates the perception of a laser precise imaging with easily discernible phantom image locations and more delineation between the instruments. On the other hand, wider dispersion tends to have a more spacious and larger sounding image with fuzzier delineation and less precision and placement. So which is right, though, right? I mean, it's, I don't know the answer to that. So no matter what anyone says, and I'm sure there's already people probably writing in saying, oh, wide is way better, or narrow is way better, or whatever, there is no right answer to this. There is no research that was ever conducted that allowed us to conclude that one was better than the other. They are simply different. It's just what you like. And to be honest, probably what you like would depend on the music, and it would probably depend on the room you have the speaker in. So at the end of the day, one of the conclusions Floyd actually had was, wouldn't it be nice if we had basically adjustable acoustics with adjustable directivity speakers? In 2004, Sean Olive noted that no specific directivity index emerged as the preferred. While certain speakers are preferred over others, a conclusion cannot be drawn about the specific directivity of the speakers as an indicator of quality, other than it should be smooth. So I think it's really important to remember that this debate over wide versus narrow dispersion, it's just a preference. I mean, the research tells us a lot about how to ascertain which speakers would sound better from measurements, but the directivity index isn't one of them. It does tell us something about how they're going to sound different, but not whether it's better.
But I wonder if those results would have been more decisive if the research was done with stereo testing.
So I think the answer to that is yes, but it goes back to the idea of how would you do that test well? And as I said, I think you'd have to use something like the lexicon speaker. So studying the effects of something as specific as directivity requires that you hold all else constant. We got into this earlier. The DI can be changed over a wide range, while the frequency response remains constant at all directivity index levels, that the response is equally smooth at all angles for all adjustments of the directivity index. You cannot test this effect by simply comparing a wide versus narrow directivity speaker with any great specificity. So the problem is, if you take like a JBL M2, which is sort of like a medium to narrow dispersion speaker, you take a Martin Logan ESL, which is on the narrow dispersion side, or actually one of the flat straight, I don't remember the brands now, but one of the flat straight style electrostatics, that's like very narrow dispersion. And then you take something like, I don't know, what's
like Focal. Focal's pretty wide dispersion.
Focal, yeah, or those Vivid Audios, those are very wide dispersion. And you have people listen to them, they're going to like certain ones more than others. They're going to ascribe great differences. But what aspect of that is directivity is really hard to tell because there's so many other differences between those speakers. Previously, it was studied by simply having lots of people rate a lot of speakers and then categorizing them as high versus low DI and seeing which group had a higher average preference. It introduces a lot of bias. As I said, there's just so many differences between those speakers. If you had like a infinitely large number of speakers, like the world population of speakers and the world population of people to do it, you'd actually get pretty good results using that method. But when you actually get into the real world where you're using maybe like a dozen or 2 dozen speakers and you're using a couple dozen people, it's just not enough to actually average out the effects of the differences in the speakers. There's too many variables, basically. Now, I thought a lot of people are probably going to be curious about this spatial presentation piece, including when that Polk L800 review went live. A lot of people were complaining about crosstalk cancellation and feeling like it was a bunch of nonsense. And what I realized was a lot of people don't really understand how we reproduce the real sound image. So this is a ambisonic, high-order ambisonic microphone. And this is actually pictures from a real recording of ambisonics that was done. This is actually a pretty cool situation here that they're showing what they did. It's the most realistic way of capturing and reproducing the sound of the symphony. So there's no right answer to this. I mean, this is like a unsolved problem still. It depends on if we're talking about multi-channel versus stereo. For stereo, Sean Olive has noted that a slight preference towards wider dispersion was found. For multi-channel, studies have actually found a preference for narrow directivity. And when you get into 3D audio, like what we're talking about here, researchers actually found that it's not just preferred, it is necessary for accuracy to use narrow dispersion speakers. Part of this is that the crosstalk cancellation that's a part of the sound field recreation works better when there's very little overlap between the speakers. And when you have weaker reflections, those sidewall reflections can goof up the crosstalk cancellation quite a bit.
So that gives weight to your argument that if you're doing things for multi-channel or home theater surround, you want more absorption in the room than you would for 2-channel stereo.
Yeah. Yes, and for normal surround sound systems, it's a modest argument, probably at best. If you're talking about ambisonics, you actually need to really consider how you're going to absorb. I mean, the way those rooms are set up where ambisonics is usually recreated, if you've ever seen pictures of it, those are often 5,000 to 10,000 cubic foot rooms. They're pretty large.
Wow.
And the speakers are actually placed in a fairly small circle, often around the listener, which ends up making it so that those lateral reflections are much longer. And on top of that, the rooms are typically built as like an ITU, for instance, testing room, which has usually a very low RT time for such a large room. In other words, the decay time is very short, and those reflections are pretty weak. So in other words, if we start moving in the direction that a lot of us suspect we will, basically the kind of post-Atmos period, when we get into the next steps in sound reproduction, it may become more important that we pay attention to speaker directivity and the dryness of the room. All right, so it depends on your musical preferences. Live concert halls and other natural recordings tend to be more spacious with less precisely placed instruments. Often they have strong reflections that create very large, wide, but diffused images. Studio recordings or live musical events in very dead and small rooms, got into this earlier, have less spaciousness and they're more laser-like in their presentation, with the instruments being perceived as more of a point source. And then, of course, third, it depends on you. Research hasn't concluded that one is better than the other. So you have to enjoy it. This is like, what are you into? What do you want? What do you like? Pick your flavor. And there's nothing we can say to say you're right or wrong. Did you like that?
Yeah.
So what should reviewers do? I think I was talking to Todd Welty a bit about this too and asking his opinion and kind of laying out some of my arguments that I've made here to see if he agreed with him. And he goes, probably at the end of the day, if you're a reviewer and you're trying to do the best review you can, you need to review the speakers the way they were intended to be used. And so it makes sense to do some mono testing because it clearly is better for discerning problems with timbre and nonlinearities in the speaker. And on the other hand, imaging is a very complex thing that has a lot of different dimensions to it. And doing so with 2 or more speakers is probably going to help us better ascertain how that speaker is going to sound for the average user. And so we can describe better what you're going to hear. So we believe it's best to listen to 2 or more speakers for stereo or multi-channel when we're doing reviews. Measurements can tell us a lot about the nonlinearities that exist. So one of the arguments we would make is that we're not scientists, we're not researchers, and our job as reviewers is not necessarily to tell you whether the problems that we see in there are overly audible in mono. If they are really audible, we should pick them up in stereo too. as I said before, even though you're more likely to pick them up in mono, you're not going to listen that way.
Mhm.
On the other hand, though, we already know what kinds of resonances in the speakers tend to be audible or not. Lots of research has gone into that. We measure the speakers well. So if we see something really anomalous, we can basically say, well, that should be audible. We'll let you know if we heard it. That's a problem versus a speaker that's very smooth and flat. We would say there's nothing that should be audibly problematic. And of course, probably we're listening, we wouldn't hear anything.
So one thing, I think Sean mentioned this to you. There's a difference between a scientist and a reviewer, like you was saying.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of the mono testing that Harman and others do, it's a much easier way to test multiples of speakers without having positional differences as great as you would as a stereo pair. It's easier to switch, one speaker at a time, even if especially if they're doing that platform. And I really, at the end of the day, think it's great to do mono listening just to hear the tonal balance of the speaker. I've taken speakers in where I just plugged in one and I instantly heard that there was too much boom in the mid range. Right, I probably would not have heard that as easily in stereo, but I could hear the vocals were colored in the one particular speaker versus one that was tonally neutral. Within minutes, I was able to discern that. But at the end of the day, stereo testing is really going to tell you not only how the speaker images, but also if there's consistency between the two samples. Because I've gotten in speakers where one of the crossovers had a tweeter wired out of phase when it shouldn't have been. So the first sample I measured fine. But then when I plugged them in, I couldn't get a good phantom image. And then I measured the other speaker and I saw within the impedance plot, something was up. And then I realized one of the drivers were wired out of phase. So stereo listening really tells you a bunch of things. It tells you the imaging, sound staging of the speaker, it tells you the consistency that they can make two speakers measure and sound identical. And at the end of the day, if you want the best kind of imaging in a speaker, they really need to be consistent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've actually been surprised at the amount of, we probably should start measuring both speakers and showing the consistency in the sample, but we have found in the past when we have bothered to do that, that there can be substantial differences. What we tend to see is that basically once you get to like maybe $500 a pair on up kind of a thing, there aren't huge differences in most of the speakers. They seem to be pretty well made, half a dB or so kind of thing. Some of the cheaper speakers though, it's like, there's places where you're seeing 2-3 dB differences, and it looks like the parts matching was non-existent.
Parts matching, and also think about the capacitors. They may be using 10% parts instead of 5% parts, or the tweeter variances. I mean, it's really hard to get consistent tweeters. You could buy a batch of tweeters, and they all measure differently. Even some of the expensive ones. Quality control is really a difficult thing.
That's definitely true, but I'll say that I think on the really cheap ones, they're paying probably like 25 cents a piece for those or less. And as a result, I don't know what you can expect out of them. So I think this raises a question for a lot of people who are going to say, all right, so you guys have laid out your stance. Audioholics believes that reviews should be done, at least in part, with stereo testing as part of it. So we've already said we agree that mono is a good thing to do, but it's not the only way. We like to do a lot of the review in stereo. Should you be able to trust us then, since the research seemed to suggest that mono was the better way to go? And our answer is, we think so, of course, at least as much as you would trust anyone's opinion other than your own. Our speaker reviews tend to include accurate semi-anechoic measurements of speakers showing the on-axis listening window power response and dispersion waterfalls. We usually include impedance measurements. Basically, if it's anybody but me, you're going to get impedance measurements. And if it's me, you're going to have to bug me because I'll probably forget. And I promise I'm going to add it to the pokes as soon as I get a chance to unpack them again. Our subjective impressions of the speakers, we always tell you what we think. At the end of the day, just because I tell you the speaker sounds good doesn't mean it's going to sound good to you. I mean, that's something that we can't really answer. We don't do blind comparisons. So I know some people feel like that needs to be done, but to be honest, especially because we don't necessarily keep a lot of speakers around at any one time, it can be difficult. But then you also got to think about it from the manufacturer's standpoint. If we start doing blind comparisons, and you think, again, being practical Gene, at any one time, do you have 3 essentially identical speakers sitting around from different brands?
Not in price.
No, they probably would be different price points, and people may not cross shop them. They may be something worth cross shopping, but that's a separate issue.
Right.
And so for us to do these blind comparisons and say, I mean, the problem then becomes, I don't know, besides the fact that they're very difficult to set up and do right. Again, Sean and I were talking about that earlier today, and he had pointed out that they can be really hard to do right. I think this isn't like a death match where like 3 go in, 1 comes out kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
We review products typically on their own merits. We provide objective measurements as a reflection of the engineering and our subjective opinions. You guys know we have occasionally done some comparisons. I think Gene, you and I were just talking about doing another one at your place pretty soon. It's not like we'd never like to put speakers up against each other. It's just that to do that in every review can be difficult just because it's hard to pull stuff together.
Oh yeah,
and have that around. Yeah. So I think that's
the other thing I wanted to bring up, and I don't think we talked about this, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you look at the mono testing that's been done in Harman, all the pictures I've seen, it looks like they're listening on axis to the speaker. Do they ever actually do off axis listening, or is it at the primary on axis position?
So I would have to ask Sean or Todd if they actually play around with that. I think I had mentioned to you before. So one of the potential issues are that not every speaker is designed to be listened on axis. And so doing them in mono right in front of you can be problematic when the speaker was intended to be a left and a right pair, and they're made asymmetrically with dispersion that is itself asymmetric, but also where the on-axis response is not the listening axis response. So a lot of people know, for instance, I have the Gedley speakers. Geddes has always designed his speakers such that 20 degrees off axis was the actual listening axis. 0 degrees was meant to be way off to the side. And it's done on purpose for a particular effect, which helps to make for a wider and more stable image. It would be very difficult to do that kind of a test then in mono.
Yeah, and the same thing with like the RBH SVTRS system, where it has the tweeter on the inside of the cabinet. You don't want to be sitting on excuse me, you don't want to be sitting on the outside of that speaker. They're really meant to be listened as a stereo pair, and you're supposed to be between them.
Right, and they make a different speaker for the center channel that aligns the mid basses and tweeter differently.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess at the end of the day, guys, we do both. You know, we do the mono testing to see if there's any real problems with the speaker to correlate with the measurements. If Matt measures a speaker and he sees a big dip at 2 kilohertz, he'll go and do a mono test to see if you can hear the tonal implications of that measurement. But the bulk of our reviewing is going to be done as you would use the speaker, which would be a stereo pair.
So I thought people might be interested in like how reviewers or average people could try to do blind speaker tests. And here's a picture from an event that was done where somebody obviously set up a blind speaker test where they covered them with some black fabric so you couldn't see which was which. They stacked them on top of each other. And this is probably a pretty okay test for what it is, but it has problems too. And it raised something. I mean, so as I said, we think mono and stereo is best. Double blind testing outside of a laboratory is actually pretty difficult to do. It's nearly impossible to do right. Many so-called double blind tests are fraught with problems. So in experimental research in general, the gold standard approach to studying the efficacy of any form of intervention, drug trials, for instance, social interventions, speakers could be this way in a sense, randomized controlled trials. So basically you average out the differences in people by randomizing them to different conditions, and then you give one group some sort of treatment condition, the other group business as usual, or no treatment at all, or placebo. In my field of study, one of the problems that we've had as we start to look through research is there's a noted problem in a bias that gets introduced by poorly implemented randomized control trials. So they're very difficult to implement well. They're very expensive to implement well. A lot of people do them anyway, and they don't do them all that well. And the degree of evidence that it produces as compared to alternative, less rigorous methods can be a problem. Basically, less rigorous methods, but implemented right, can actually produce better evidence than poorly implemented RCTs. So when you think about it from a double-blind test standpoint, doing a double-blind test badly could actually introduce more problems and kind of create more confusion. So you got to ask yourself, like, what could you do? I mean, it's like nothing. I don't know. I mean, just cited tests then become probably just as good as badly done blind tests. But one way you could do this, where you might be able to maintain a high degree of rigor in a less scientific manner, and Gene, I've brought this up with you for testing other things like cables and stuff too, is that you could use in-ear microphones. So in-ear microphones allows you to do very accurate binaural recordings that if you do it in your ears and then you listen to those through a pair of headphones where you've compensated for the response, it's got your HRTF built in. You've compensated it out though, and then but it's still your head, and as a result, you get a very accurate binaural reproduction. So you could then play it back through an AVX app, and you could test basically two pairs of speakers if you wanted to try to hear. That would be a way of doing essentially the equivalent of double-blind testing in a very accurate way without having to set up what they did here. I mean, with this one, there's a number of problems. One of them is that lower speaker has a diffraction source between it and the upper speaker doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another thing people need to realize too when you try to compare speakers, especially in the home environment. If you're doing a stereo pair, even if you orient them A-B, there's still positional differences for each listener when you're switching between the speakers. It's never going to be perfect. And Sean, I think, once said that the positional differences can be more of a bias than doing stereo versus mono. You know, I mean, that not getting the position right for the listener can really affect the sound more than the speaker itself. So you could have two good speakers, but one of them doesn't sound so good because you're not listening in the same relative position as the other one was when you're switching.
Yeah, and you can see in this test that's done here that that's a pretty big problem. So everybody's at the right listening axis for the bottom speaker, but they're at the wrong listening axis for the top speaker, which they've flipped upside down. And if you looked at the asymmetry and the vertical dispersion of speakers, you also know that you're giving sort of a disadvantage to that top speaker by placing people in basically a bad position.
Right.
All right, well, that was the whole thing.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, nothing's perfect. You know, we try to do our best to do comparisons, and we try to do our best to evaluate products. There is a difference between the science and the review aspects of evaluating speakers. We are leaning more towards the review, obviously. The folks like at Harman and other loudspeaker companies, obviously, they lean more towards the science when they do these blind tests, single mono tests. But I still would argue that at the end of the day, they should be doing stereo testing, and they might. I don't know to what extent they do stereo testing. Maybe during the final production of the product, they run stereo testing, and maybe that's something we could follow up with Sean or others in the future.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the point of this presentation was not really to say, oh, we think Harman's doing the research wrong. It had nothing to do with that. It was more about trying to explain what we think makes sense for reviewers to do, for average listeners to do when they're trying to evaluate what speakers to buy, things like that.
Yeah. All right, guys. So I think that wraps this video up. I think I'd like to do, we should probably do a live stream on blind testing versus sighted testing so people can understand the biases that are associated with each. I don't want to get off too topic right now, but I found a lot of companies that claim they do double blind tests are not really doing double blind because they use their own staff to do the switching of the speakers. So, I mean, that's really a single blind test at best. It's not a double blind. It's very hard to do double blind. And then the people that are doing the double blind shouldn't even know what those numbers are for. They should just be evaluating the data, not even know what it's for. So we could do a whole thing on that. I think eventually that would be a good topic to cover, because especially when we're starting to look at cables, because as you know, I've been measuring cables and I see very little differences in cables. And the only way to know if you're discerning a difference in those cables without the placebo effect affecting your results is to do a blind test so you don't know which cable's being changed. So that's something we will be looking at hopefully in the future, because I do want to get into that topic more.
Yeah, we've actually been talking about how to do a proper blind test with cables, and I think it would be an interesting topic. I mean, I'm sure many would realize right away the problem with it. How do you switch between cables in a way that makes sense? Our brain adapts very quickly to sound, and we tend to forget very quickly too. So one of the problems you've got when you're switching is if there's even like 10 seconds between the switch, it's too much time. You've already forgotten what the first cable sounded like.
Yeah. And I know the Harman speaker shuffler, that takes probably a few seconds to shuffle the speaker. And like you said, humans are great comparators, but they're very bad at remembering how something sounded, you know, without the reference being there. Yeah.
I know people pick on some of the stereophile writers sometimes, for instance, when they'll say things like, based on my memory, this speaker sounds better than that one I reviewed way back when. Because the reality is you probably can't remember exactly what it sounded like. And I'm sure I've been guilty of saying something similar, but I usually try to tell people like, I don't know. I haven't had that speaker around in months. I have no idea how this one sounds compared to it.
Yeah, and the nostalgia factor really factors in too, because like in the 80s and 90s when I bought my JBLs and Sirwin Vegas, I thought they were the best speakers on the planet. Obviously, my opinions have changed over the years as I gotten better products. My frame of reference has changed. So I can't go and tell you, hey, a pair of JBL LX44s are state of the art, because that was a totally different frame of reference from what we have now. So
Yeah. Well, and you might be reflecting on more of an emotional attachment you had to the
mhm.
experience than you are to an actual difference in sound.
I will tell you this much. Back in the day when I had to earn my money and it was hard to earn money and I had to use every dollar I could to buy a speaker, I've relished that speaker much more than I do today. So there's definitely a lot to that.
Yeah, that's
Someone's asking, isn't Harman part of Samsung? Yes, actually Samsung owns Harman now. So they acquired them, I think, like 2 years ago.
yeah.
Let's see. Have more Matt around who isn't biased and doesn't sell anything, please. All right, we will. Yeah, Matt, you got to step up your game, man. You haven't been doing live streams lately. What's going on with
I
that?
know. I have another one that I've got for you on listening rooms, so we'll get into that. But I'll just say I know they're picking on Anthony. Anthony's a friend of mine, and I like him.
He's a good guy, man. Let me tell
He
you.
is.
He's been doing some great contributions to us. I really appreciate it.
He has. And when I actually had asked somebody about something he had said, one of the comments, and this is a guy that's a expert in the field, more of an academic than he is somebody who's selling products. His comment was, sometimes people pick on Anthony, but at the end of the day, he's right about a lot of things. He's really good at translating what the research says, which can often, when you look at research, this is often a big problem. It's like one of those things that's like, great, how do I put that in my room? Like there's this paper, this is a little bit off, but there's this paper on metasurfaces that were used as acoustic diffusers. And I was reading it and I thought it was so cool because they basically figured out how to make diffusers that are the equivalent of like a 12-inch deep diffuser, only about like 1 inch deep. And it has to do with how the surface is treated. But essentially there's like a nautilus kind of a thing. Like the way that the sound hits the surface, it has to travel inside of a little tunnel and then it has to come back out. And so you can make different path lengths basically inside this metasurface and you get really good diffusion. I thought that's so cool, but like nobody sells that. But it's just a research paper. Anthony's got a knack for being able to kind of hear all of these different findings and then figure out how you can actually apply them in a room. And he's come up with a lot of rules of thumb that are actually helpful for people that are trying to treat rooms. And even though there's a lot of truth to the notion that a pretty standard living room can be made to sound very good, which is normal furnishings and just a little bit of treatment, when you're talking about a dedicated theater, there is no normal furnishings, right? Like who has a bookshelf in their dedicated home theater? You actually have to be much more purposeful. And in those situations, a lot of what he says, I think, is actually reasonable.
So I'll tell you something interesting, and you're going to find this next time you come over to my place now that I'm getting some of my systems set up. When I moved into this house, the new Audioholics Smart House, I was anticipating this is my office. This is where I'm setting up a 2-channel listening area. I was like, this is going to be really kick-ass. It's going to sound great. Even though I don't have any treatments up, I just expected it to sound good. Hooked up the Rebels, wasn't impressed at all. There wasn't enough bass. It sounded very dry. Wasn't happy. I put a pair of $2,000 Paradigms downstairs in my family room, which is open to the kitchen, open to the rest of the house, has a glass slider. I put a big diffused wall behind it, and I could not believe how good those speakers imaged. And everything was perfect but the bass. I just don't have enough bass because they're not bass capable speakers. But I never in a million years would have expected that room to sound good. And I can't wait to get like all the speakers working, like the Atmos channels and the surrounds and the in-wall subwoofers. We're going to be doing listening tests in that room when we compare speakers because it's an open room. It's just, I did not expect a room like that to actually sound good with no room treatments. It just worked out that way. And Anthony even talked about sometimes you could just get the room right without putting a lot of effort into it.
It's true. And actually, he and I are so I have a client right now, and he's got a room that's best described as like the room from hell. So we took measurements of his room, and he sent me the data file, and I was looking through the data file. And the first thing I always look at is the RT60 or the RDT of the room, and the time. So a really normal room is going to fall somewhere between 0.2 seconds and 0.5 seconds. That's, I mean, 90% of the rooms I measure fall somewhere between those. And like when I say 90%, the other 9.9% fall between 0.5 seconds and 0.7 seconds. This room was 1.8 seconds at the highest point, and it was very uneven. It ranged between 1.2 and 1.8 seconds. That's unusually long. And the room itself is big, but it's not that big. Like, it's actually going to be pretty close to the same size as the living room in the new house I'm building. The difference was, instead of having like 10-foot or 12-foot ceilings, he has 25-foot cathedral ceilings, tons of glass walls, and it's all open to a very large glass hard surfaced area. And the house is built unusually well, very tight construction. And so it's so reflective that he's got this room that, like, that room can't be brought down to 0.5 seconds. And Anthony and I were talking about it because it's like one of those, how do you treat that room? Like, there's obvious stuff, you're going to put some absorbers in it, but like,
headphones.
Is the goal? Yeah. And so actually what we're doing in his room is we're going to do the Dutch and Dutch 8Cs. And the reason for that is that speaker has a very controlled directivity, even in the bass. And so it's going to work better in a room like that. And then the other thing is, yes, there's going to be absorption added, but there's going to be more of an acceptance that it's not going to be a 0.5 second room. It's not going to be that dry. It can't be. Rooms that are like that often actually sound fine, even though they have a very high RDT time. They're always going to be more spacious, but it's like just kind of bringing it down to a more even, let's say 1 second is fine in a room with that big of a volume. And my guess, I mean, I haven't heard it finished yet, but my guess is that room actually will sound really good. I mean, it's not uncommon for rooms like that to sound good. They're not going to be as intimate as small, well-treated rooms are, but they've got their own unique qualities.
Yeah, we could do a whole video just on that topic. I mean, that's good stuff to talk about. In fact, I asked Anthony if he could do some case studies on rooms he's done, and we could just focus on that. I think people would really like to see that kind of stuff on this channel.
Yeah, he and I have sent before and after RDTs to each other. Just especially, I think we more like to send the before ones when they're way off, where we're like, how did that happen? Oh my gosh. They're hard to treat when they're really bad.
All right, guys, I think we are wrapped up for tonight. It is midnight here, and I got to get some work done, and I'm sure you probably have to go to bed. You're not a late person like I am. But appreciate you doing this presentation, Matt. Guys, don't forget, this is on our Patreon at patreon.com/audioholics. You'll have the PDF access there if you become a member. And next week, we'll have Anthony back at this time. And we're going to be talking about, I don't even know what we're going to be talking about, to be honest with you. We kind of decide like a few days before, but we will announce it in the community tab. And we will have Matt on again because we have a lot of stuff to discuss. Things are going to start happening quickly with the Audioholics Smart House in the next couple of months. And I'm going to be having Matt here to help me do some room measurements. He's also going to help me tune the RBH system. They're going to be coming down in June, and we're going to get really into the DSP tuning and really try to push the envelope of performance with all these tools we have at our disposal. So get ready to do some driving, Matt.
Sounds good.
All right, guys, have a good night. And until next time, keep listening.